The night air was thick with silence, the kind that carries both exhaustion and dread. A cold wind drifted through the trees, stirring the scent of wet earth and gunpowder. In the half-light before dawn, the horizon was neither dark nor bright, just suspended, waiting. Somewhere beyond the hills, the war was ending. But here, it still breathed through the trembling of boots, the rustle of worn fabric, the shallow rhythm of women trying not to be heard. Their faces were hollowed by sleepless nights, their uniforms stiff with dust and fear. Each step felt like walking towards something they could not name, but had already accepted. They didn't speak because words had lost meaning. Only glances passed between them, quick, uncertain, heavy, with unspoken prayers. They had been told what capture meant: humiliation, hunger, death. Those warnings clung to them more tightly than their own coats. Every sound behind the trees, every flicker of movement, made their hearts twist tighter. Some still believed rescue might come. Others knew better. The silence of the road was their only answer. When the order came short, foreign, echoing through the cold, it felt unreal. A command in another language, sharp and final. Hands rose almost instinctively, though no one had the strength left to resist. The world narrowed to footsteps, the crunch of gravel, the weight of eyes watching from the shadows. No one dared to look back. Somewhere ahead, the light shifted, pale and unfamiliar, spilling over fences and strange silhouettes. One woman hesitated, her breath caught between terror and disbelief. "Is this where it ends?" she whispered. No one replied. Only the wind answered, carrying the faint metallic sound of gates beginning to open. The sound of the gates creaking open lingered in the air long after they had passed through. The women moved as if in a trance, each step slow, deliberate, weighed down by exhaustion and uncertainty. The dawn had come fully now, but it brought no warmth, only a pale, indifferent light that revealed everything they wished to hide: torn uniforms, hollow faces, trembling hands, clutching at nothing. Beyond, the wire rows of tents stretched out in quiet precision, and somewhere nearby, a truck engine rumbled to life. It was not the chaos they had imagined. There were no shouts, no rifles pressed to their backs. Just order, just routine. And somehow that frightened them even more. They had spent years being told that the enemy had no mercy. The radio broadcasts had repeated it endlessly. The posters in their towns had warned them. Once captured, they would be shamed, broken, perhaps never seen again. To be taken alive was not survival, it was disgrace. Those words had burned themselves into memory, shaping every heartbeat, every glance. Yet here they were still alive, standing on foreign soil, waiting for a punishment that never came. That quiet felt like a trick, a cruelty too refined to understand. Aiko walked near the front of the line, her body stiff with vigilance. She could not remember when she had last eaten or when she had last spoken aloud. Around her, the others looked like reflections of her own fear, eyes darting, shoulders hunched, the instinct to hide still pulsing in every movement. The road to this place had stripped them of everything except the will to keep walking. Hunger had replaced thought. Fear had replaced faith. For days they had moved south, clutching to rumors that surrender to the Americans might mean something less terrible than falling into the hands of the Soviets. The officers had vanished, the chain of command dissolved into whispers and confusion. Each morning they woke with fewer companions. Some fled into the woods, hoping to find their families. Others simply lay down by the roadside and never rose again. When the gunfire had faded behind them, there was no victory left to believe in, only the instinct to survive one more hour. They had been soldiers once, or at least parts of the machinery that called itself an army. Telephone operators, clerks, messengers, women drawn in by necessity, by patriotism, or simply by the absence of choice. They had watched cities burn from behind. Switchboards had listened to officers shout orders that led nowhere. Each voice on the line had sounded more desperate than the last, until even the machines seemed to hum with panic. By the end, the messages had become fragments: bridges gone, roads cut off, headquarters silent. When the signal died completely, so did the illusion of control. Now, walking under a foreign flag, they could no longer tell which part of them was still loyal and which part was simply human. Their uniforms, once symbols of order and duty, had become rags that marked them as defeated. Every button, every insignia, seemed to weigh 10 pounds heavier. Some wanted to tear them off to vanish into anonymity, but fear stopped them. To remove the uniform might mean deceit, and deceit might mean death. Better to face the enemy honestly, they told themselves. Better to be humiliated as soldiers than hunted as liars. The camp was quiet except for the rhythmic murmur of distant voices. Somewhere to their left, a group of guards stood near a table writing down names. The sound of pens scratching paper carried farther than any gunshot. One by one, the women were called forward. Each name spoken aloud felt like a verdict, final and cold. They answered softly, their accents breaking their throats dry. The men behind the tables didn't sneer or shout. They just wrote, nodded, and gestured to move along. It was almost mechanical, like the ticking of a clock that would not stop. Aiko kept her eyes low, afraid to meet anyone's gaze. She could still feel the echo of the last broadcast she had heard before fleeing better death than dishonor. It had been said with such conviction that she had believed it without question. Yet now, standing here alive, she could not tell if she was honorable or merely foolish. The lines blurred just as the air between them shimmered with fatigue and dust. The first rations came at midday, bread rough and dry, but real. Some hesitated, thinking it might be a test. Others tore into it greedily, hands shaking. Aiko held hers for a long moment before taking a bite. It tasted foreign, dense, almost bitter, but it was food. She swallowed it slowly, feeling it settle in her stomach like a confession. Around her, the murmurs began to change. The fear was still there, but quieter, now replaced by something heavier, shame. To be fed by those they had been told to hate was a humiliation that no one had prepared for. Later, as the sun dropped behind the trees, the camp fell into stillness. The guards changed shifts. Shadows lengthened across the wire. Somewhere, a dog barked sharp and distant. The women sat close together, their bodies pressed for warmth, the earth beneath them damp and cold. They whispered half-formed thoughts, trying to make sense of what had not happened. No executions, no punishment, no degradation. Just waiting. The uncertainty gnawed at them more than hunger ever had. In the fading light, Aiko looked toward the horizon, where smoke still drifted from the ruins of what had been their homeland. She tried to remember the streets of her city, the laughter of neighbors, the smell of rice cooking on summer evenings. It all felt impossibly far away, as though belonging to another lifetime. What frightened her most was not that she might never return, it was that she no longer knew who she would be if she did. The war had ended outside, but inside her it still moved like a current she could not stop. A distant voice called out again, the same sharp tone that had first ordered them to raise their hands. It was time for another roll call. The women rose silently, lining up as they had been trained to do. The simple act of standing in rows obeying felt both comforting and humiliating. Obedience was the only thing left that made sense. Yet as they stood there, something in the air shifted, a murmur among the guards. A command passed quietly down the line. They were to move again deeper into the camp. They gathered their few belongings, a torn scarf, a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, a locket hidden under a collar. The column moved forward, boots scraping against the gravel. Beyond the wire, new shapes emerged, structures unfamiliar. The faint glow of lamps flickering through canvas walls. The air smelled of soap and smoke, strange and sterile. Aiko tightened her grip on her satchel, though she knew there was nothing inside worth keeping. Each step carried the weight of everything they had lost and everything they still feared to lose. The camp ahead loomed not as a refuge, but as a question with no clear answer. Were they being spared or simply postponed? The rhythm of their footsteps merged with the heartbeat of the place, steady, controlled, almost merciful in its indifference. When they reached the next enclosure, the guards stopped them. One pointed toward a small building and spoke in curt phrases none of them understood. The interpreter, a young man with tired eyes, repeated the order in broken words they could grasp. Rest here. Tomorrow, inspection. Inspection. The word hung in the air, heavy, uncertain. No one dared to ask what it meant. They nodded, though their throats ached from dryness. The women entered the dim shelter, its floor covered with straw, the smell of damp wood clinging to everything. Some sat, some lay down immediately, others simply stared at the walls as if expecting them to move. Aiko sat near the entrance, knees drawn to her chest, listening to the muffled sounds outside, the shifting of boots, the clang of a metal door, the low murmur of a radio, playing somewhere far away. The melody was soft, unfamiliar, and unbearably human. It reminded her of nights before the war of laughter that had not been tinged with fear. The realization stung more than hunger. Sleep came fitfully in fragments. In the moments between dreams, Aiko saw faces she had known, voices calling her name, a light she could not reach. When morning came, the sky was pale and merciless, the air colder than before. The guards appeared again, orderly, silent, holding clipboards and metal canisters. The women were told to stand, to form lines. The interpreter repeated the word they now dreaded: inspection. Aiko felt her stomach twist. Her hands trembled, though she tried to still them. Around her, others exchanged frightened glances. They did not know what kind of inspection awaited them, only that it had to do with the words they had heard whispered since capture: hygiene, disease, delousing. None of it sounded like mercy. The line began to move. Gravel crunched beneath their boots. The smell of chemicals drifted in the wind. For a moment, Aiko thought she heard running water somewhere ahead, a steady, rhythmic sound. She swallowed hard, unable to decide whether it was a promise or a threat. As they approached the wooden building at the edge of the camp, her breath caught. Steam rose faintly from the roof, curling into the cold air like a ghost. The others saw it too. Their steps slowed. The fear that had been buried under exhaustion began to stir again, sharp and alive. One woman whispered something, words too low to catch, but Aiko understood the meaning without hearing them. This was the moment they had been dreading since the gates first opened. The moment when fear and truth would finally meet. And as the guards gestured them forward, she realized there was no turning back. Whatever waited beyond that door, it would change everything. The building stood at the edge of the camp like something out of a dream, plain, colorless, and quiet, except for the faint hiss of steam that drifted from its roof. Morning light spilled over the frost-covered ground, painting the air in silver mist. The women hesitated at the threshold, too cold to shiver, too drained to speak. Aiko watched as the guards moved with calm precision, unhurried, detached, their faces unreadable beneath the shadows of their helmets. It wasn't cruelty that unsettled her. It was the order, the strange mechanical rhythm of a system she couldn't comprehend. Everything here seemed designed, rehearsed, as if they had stepped into a world that followed rules unknown to them. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the sharp scent of chemicals and metal. Tables were lined up in rows, each covered with papers, thermometers, small tins, and brushes. Men in khaki uniforms and women with white armbands worked side by side, calling out names, marking notes, passing metal instruments from one to another. It looked more like a clinic than a prison, and that was precisely what made it terrifying. The absence of rage, the lack of punishment. It all felt too calculated, too deliberate, like the quiet before something worse. They were told to line up again. The interpreter's voice trembled slightly as he repeated the order. His tone wasn't cruel, just exhausted, as though he too wanted this to end quickly. Aiko stood near the middle of the line. Around her, whispers rippled like a nervous current. What are they doing? Why are there doctors? It's not medicine, it's poison. The words slithered through the air, clinging to the walls, feeding the same dread they had carried since capture. When the first woman stepped forward, the room fell into silence. Papers rustled, pens scratched, boots shifted. A doctor lifted her chin, examined her eyes, then motioned for her sleeve to be rolled up. The woman obeyed, stiff and trembling. A nurse leaned closer, scribbling something in a notebook. Then came a metallic click, the lid of a canister opening. White powder fell like snow onto the woman's shoulders. She flinched, gasping, brushing at her hair. The nurse said something in English, calm and clipped. The interpreter murmured, "For lice, not poison." The explanation did little to help. The next woman began to cry. The one behind her froze entirely. Aiko felt her own throat tighten as the line moved forward. The air filled with the dry, choking smell of dust. It clung to their skin, their clothes, their breath. It didn't matter what the nurse had said, every motion of the hand, every hiss of the powder felt like preparation for death. When it was Aiko's turn, she kept her eyes on the floor. A pair of gloved hands reached out, turning her face upward, examining the hollow under her eyes. The doctor didn't look cruel, only distant, as if she were nothing more than a name on a form. The powder came next. A sudden cold burst over her shoulders, her hair, her neck. She coughed, eyes stinging, resisting the instinct to step back. "Don't move," the interpreter warned softly. "It's just cleaning." The word meant nothing. Cleaning. What did that mean in a place like this? When they were told to remove their outer clothing, a ripple of panic swept through the group. The command was given without malice, but it hit like a blow. Some protested in broken English. Others simply froze, clutching their coats as if they were shields. The guards didn't shout. They only gestured firm, but not violent. Reluctantly, the women obeyed. One by one, uniforms fell into piles on the floor, revealing the pale outlines of bodies that had not known warmth in weeks. The humiliation pressed heavier than the cold. Aiko's hands trembled as she unbuttoned her jacket, her breath uneven. The nurses moved quickly, efficient, their eyes focused only on their work. Thermometers slid beneath tongues, notes were written, arms inspected for bites or wounds. There was no cruelty, but no empathy either, only the smooth detachment of routine. The mechanical kindness of it was worse than hatred. It made them feel invisible. When it was over, they were handed rough towels and pointed toward a door at the back of the building. From beyond it came the steady sound of rushing water. Steam coiled around the doorway like breath. "Showers," the interpreter said, his voice barely audible. The word rippled through the line. Some women stopped entirely, refusing to move. Others exchanged desperate glances. Everyone had heard stories. Stories from the East, from camps where the word shower meant death. Aiko felt her knees weaken. Her mind flashed with all the whispers she'd heard during the retreat camps, gas smoke rising over fields. She didn't know what to believe anymore, only that fear was safer than hope. The guards' expressions didn't change. They might as well have been moving furniture. "Go one," said simply. Next. The line crept forward. Steam filled the air, blurring edges, softening outlines, until everything seemed unreal. The women held their towels tight against their chests, bare feet pressing against the cold concrete. No one spoke. The only sounds were water and breath. Somewhere near the front, someone began to sob quietly. The guards didn't respond. They just kept the line moving. Aiko counted each step until she reached the door. The heat struck her first wet, heavy, almost alive. The air smelled of metal and soap. Inside, the walls were slick with condensation. Pipes ran overhead, dripping rhythmically, and from one of them water hissed out in a fine mist. A nurse stood nearby, motioning them inward. Quickly, she said, her accent strange but clear. Aiko hesitated. Her body refused to move, even as the line behind her pressed forward. She closed her eyes and stepped inside. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then a sudden burst of water struck her shoulders, hot, real, unexpected. She gasped, flinching away, waiting for the sting of gas that never came. Instead, warmth spread down her arms, her back, her legs. Her skin prickled. The towel fell from her hands. Soap was thrust toward her, rough and olive-colored, stamped with foreign letters. She rubbed it between her palms, almost afraid to believe in it. The smell was sharp, chemical, but clean. Around her, others began to move. The sound of water striking skin filled the room, soft and uneven, punctuated by quiet sobs. Some cried from relief, others from shame. The steam thickened until faces blurred together. For the first time in weeks, Aiko felt something other than fear. It wasn't safety, just the strange ache of being human again. But even that small mercy came laced with confusion. Why were they being treated this way? Why care for the defeated? She couldn't reconcile it. Every motion of kindness felt like another trick, another test of faith she no longer had. When the water finally stopped, the silence returned heavy and complete. They stood still, dripping, uncertain what to do. A nurse passed through, handing out thin towels, her eyes fixed on the floor. The gesture was simple, almost indifferent, yet it struck Aiko harder than any punishment could have. Outside, the air was cold again. Their clothes had been returned, folded neatly in piles. The uniforms still smelled of powder and dust, but cleaner, now almost sterile. The women dressed quickly, avoiding one another's eyes. When they were led back toward the enclosure, no one spoke. Their minds were too full of questions that had no shape. Back behind the wire, the camp seemed unchanged. The same fences, the same towers, the same watchful stillness. And yet something inside the women had shifted. They were still captives, still under guard. But the terror that had defined every breath was beginning to dissolve, replaced by something quieter, harder to name. Not trust, not relief. Just the uneasy awareness that everything they had believed might have been wrong. That night, as they lay on the straw again, Aiko couldn't sleep. The warmth of the shower still lingered on her skin, mingling with the memory of fear. She could hear others breathing nearby, restless, turning in their sleep. The camp was silent, except for the occasional creak of boots on patrol. She stared into the darkness, trying to understand what had happened, what it meant. The war had taught her that mercy was a lie, that compassion was weakness. Yet here, in this strange place, she had been given both without explanation, without reason. She turned the bar of soap over in her hands, tracing the letters pressed into its surface. The smell clung to her fingertips. It was foreign, unfamiliar, and yet comforting in a way that frightened her. She wanted to throw it away, to reject what it symbolized, but she couldn't. It was proof that the world was no longer what she'd been told it was. Sleep finally came shallow and uneasy. Outside, the fog settled over the camp, dimming the lamps, softening the lines between fence and sky. Somewhere beyond, a guard coughed, and the faint echo carried across the stillness. The world felt suspended, waiting. And in that fragile pause, Aiko realized that the war inside her was far from over. The next morning broke with the sharp sound of boots against gravel and the metallic ring of orders shouted in 2 languages. The fog had not yet lifted, and the camp looked ghostly in the pale light. Aiko stirred, her body sore from the hard ground, her thoughts tangled between fear and the strange warmth that still lingered from the day before. The guards moved briskly, their faces expressionless. Something was happening, something larger, more deliberate. She could feel it in the air, that quiet pressure before a storm. When the interpreter appeared at the gate, his clipboard in hand, the women instinctively straightened. His voice was flat but clear. All prisoners, gather for transfer. Transfer. The word rippled through the enclosure like a gust of cold wind. No one knew what it meant. No one dared to ask. The women gathered their things, towels, small bundles, scraps of belongings that had somehow survived the march. Aiko felt her hands shake. As she adjusted her jacket, the fabric still faintly damp from yesterday's shower. Around her, the others exchanged uneasy glances, whispers too soft to understand. It didn't matter what language fear spoke, it sounded the same everywhere. They were herded into formation again, 5 rows across, moving through the gates toward a section of the camp they had not seen before. The air smelled faintly of soap and smoke, of something clean and mechanical. Ahead stood a series of wooden structures, their windows clouded with condensation, steam drifting lazily into the cold morning. The sight made Aiko's stomach twist. Memories of the whispered rumors clawed at her mind, stories of camps in the east, of gas, and deceit, of showers that became death. The word transfer began to sound like a sentence. The line stopped near one of the buildings. Guards moved along the sides, counting, correcting, ensuring the formation remained perfect. There was no shouting, no violence, only discipline. That made it worse. The absence of anger felt like the calm of executioners who had done this many times before. One of the women began to cry quietly. Another muttered a prayer under her breath. The interpreter gave the next order. All personal items down. Bags, scarves, small trinkets fell to the ground with dull thuds. The women obeyed silent, except for the rustle of fabric. Then came the second command. Remove coats, shirts. A hush swept through the group. No one moved. The interpreter looked uneasy, glancing toward the officer beside him. The officer's tone was harder, now his words clipped and final. "Do it." Aiko's breath caught. Her hands froze on the buttons of her jacket. Around her, the others hesitated too, some pleading softly, others too numb to protest. The guards didn't raise their rifles, didn't threaten. They simply waited. That quiet insistence was more terrifying than any shouted order. Eventually, one woman in the front gave in, unbuttoning her coat and letting it fall. Another followed. The sound of fabric hitting the ground echoed in the still air, soft but final. When Aiko's turn came, she moved mechanically. Each motion felt detached, as if her body belonged to someone else. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons, her breath shallow. She felt the cold bite at her skin, the weight of humiliation pressing into her chest. Around her, the women stood exposed, clutching themselves, eyes fixed on the ground. No one dared to meet another's gaze. The nurses, dressed in white armbands, moved among them, examining arms, necks, hair, their gloved hands, impersonal, methodical. They didn't speak, except to call for notes or supplies. Then came the sound that froze every heart in the room. A sudden hiss, faint but unmistakable, followed by a wave of warm air. Steam began to roll from the pipes overhead. Aiko's throat closed. She felt her pulse hammer in her ears. This was it, the end. Someone screamed, a raw, broken sound that shattered the silence. Others began to pray aloud, their voices overlapping in chaos. Aiko couldn't move, every muscle locked. She waited for the pain, for the gas, for the suffocation that had haunted their nightmares. But it didn't come. Instead, water fell. Real water, hot, alive, cascading from the pipes in a steady rush. The screams turned to gasps. Aiko flinched as it struck her shoulders, then stood frozen as heat spread through her body. For a long moment, no one moved, too afraid to believe. Then, tentatively, one woman reached out, rubbing her arms, watching the dirt melt away. Another followed. The room filled with the sound of water hitting skin, the quiet sobs of disbelief. It wasn't poison. It wasn't death. It was just water. Aiko tilted her head back. The warmth hit her face, running down her cheeks like tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. The water was scalding, almost painful, but it was real. She reached for the bar of soap, thrust into her hands, a coarse green block stamped with foreign letters. It smelled sharp and clean. She rubbed it between her palms, feeling the foam build sliding across her arms and shoulders, turning brown as it carried away weeks of grime and fear. Around her, voices began to break, small, trembling sounds of disbelief and relief. Some cried openly, their sobs drowned by the rush of water. Others laughed weakly, the sound brittle but human. For the first time, they didn't look like soldiers or prisoners or enemies. They looked like people, frightened, fragile, and alive. The steam thickened until the air shimmered, turning everything soft and indistinct. Aiko could no longer see the faces around her, only blurred shapes, moving slowly, reverently, as if performing some sacred ritual. The fear that had wrapped around her heart for days began to loosen, replaced by something else, something she didn't have a name for. It wasn't trust. It wasn't safety. It was the smallest flicker of faith that the world might not be entirely cruel. When the water stopped, silence fell again. It was not the silence of dread this time, but of stunned relief. The nurses reappeared, handing out towels without expression. The women took them, mechanically drying themselves, still afraid to speak too loudly, as if sound might break the fragile spell. Aiko's hands trembled as she dressed again, the rough fabric scratching against freshly cleaned skin. The air outside felt sharper, now almost new. As they stepped back into the cold sunlight, broke through the clouds, striking the camp in slanted gold. The ground steamed where the water had spilled. Aiko glanced down at her hands, red from heat, trembling still, and for a moment she couldn't tell whether she was shaking from cold or from the sheer strangeness of being alive. She caught sight of the interpreter standing nearby, his face unreadable, his uniform damp at the cuffs. He met her eyes for the briefest instant before looking away. There was no malice there, only weariness. The guards moved them back toward their quarters, the routine resuming, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But something had shifted. The fear that had kept them small, silent, and ready to die, no longer fit the shape of the world around them. They had seen something impossible, mercy disguised as procedure. Later, sitting in the fading afternoon light, Aiko turned the bar of soap over in her hand. Its surface was rough, chipped at the corners, still wet from use. She held it close, studying the unfamiliar letters pressed into it, trying to imagine the hands that had made it. Was it meant for soldiers, for prisoners, for anyone at all? She couldn't know, but she understood now that it didn't matter. What mattered was that it existed, that someone, somewhere, had decided that even the defeated deserved to be clean. The others sat in silence around her, their faces calm but distant. Some smiled faintly when their eyes met, as if sharing a secret none of them could yet put into words. The world outside the fence was still broken, still bleeding, but inside this strange enclosure, something fragile had been restored. The warmth of the water still lingered in their bones, a quiet defiance against everything they had been taught to believe. That night, the camp was eerily still. The guards' footsteps faded into the distance. The women lay on their straw mats, the smell of soap and steam clinging to the air. Aiko stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines of condensation above her. For the first time since capture, her heart didn't race with fear. Instead, it beat softly, steadily, like a reminder. She thought of the water, the heat, the shock of it against her skin. She thought of how in that moment she had felt something she thought she'd lost forever: dignity. Tears slipped quietly down her temples, though she wasn't sure what they were, for relief, shame, or the painful realization that the enemy had given her back a piece of her own humanity. The world outside could crumble the war, could twist names and faces into lies, but nothing could change the truth of that moment. It had not been kindness, perhaps. It had been order, routine, a system followed without thought. But to Aiko, it was enough. Enough to break the walls of fear that had ruled her life. Enough to prove that survival was more than breath. It was the stubborn, fragile act of still believing in life, even when everything had tried to take it away. The camp settled into a rhythm, after that day, a rhythm that was both suffocating and strangely comforting. The routine became its own kind of silence: meals. At dawn, roll calls under the pale light, medical checks, the slow murmur of foreign orders they were beginning to recognize without translation. Everything moved with a dull precision, as if time itself had been reduced to tasks. Aiko no longer counted the days. She counted gestures instead, the way the guards passed bread. Without looking, the sound of laughter drifting faintly from their barracks, the soft thud of footsteps outside the fence at night. Life had shrunk to a handful of details, but within those details she found something she hadn't expected: clarity. She saw the world differently now. The fear that once distorted every face, every movement, had dulled into watchfulness. The Americans were no longer monsters. They were young, tired, and human in ways she had never imagined. Some had freckles, others spoke with accents. Even their own countrymen seemed not to understand. One of them, a lanky boy who handed out rations, always whistled the same tune, melancholy, repetitive, like a memory he couldn't let go. Aiko didn't know the song, but its rhythm stayed with her, filling the spaces where fear used to live. Each morning she watched how the camp woke, the guards shifting their weight, the nurses walking briskly across the yard, their white coats catching the light. The small rituals fascinated her. The folding of blankets, the sweeping of pathways, the careful inventory of supplies. These were acts of control in a world that had lost its meaning. Perhaps that was what survival really was, not defiance, but the quiet insistence on order. The women around her were changing too. They spoke more now, cautiously at first, then with a growing sense of release. Conversations about home began to surface, about mothers and brothers, about schools, about small corners of the world they once thought they'd never see again. No one mentioned the war directly, but its shadow threaded through every word. Aiko listened more than she spoke. The language of fear had exhausted her. Now she wanted only silence that didn't hurt. Sometimes the guards would linger near the fence, smoking cigarettes, watching the women without hostility, almost with curiosity. One afternoon, as Aiko carried a bucket of water from the well, she caught one of them looking at her. He was young, maybe no older than she was, his uniform creased from wear. When their eyes met, he didn't look away immediately. Instead, he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, not of rank or submission, but of existence. It lasted only a second, yet it felt heavier than words. Later, she thought about that moment, while sitting beside the fire pit where the women warmed their hands before evening roll call. None of them spoke of kindness. Kindness was still too dangerous a word, but something had shifted among them, an unspoken understanding that not all gestures needed to be questioned. For weeks they had looked at the Americans through the eyes of propaganda, expecting cruelty behind every act. Now they were beginning to see what the war had tried to erase, that even enemies followed rules, that rules themselves could be a fragile form of mercy. The nurses, too, had softened. When one of the prisoners fell ill with fever, an American nurse came to check on her daily. She didn't speak their language, but she communicated through tone, through touch, through the quiet patience of someone doing what she believed was right. Aiko watched as the nurse pressed a damp cloth to the woman's forehead, her movements precise yet gentle. For years, Aiko had associated foreign hands with violence, but these hands carried something else, something that felt dangerously close to compassion. The first time Aiko accepted a piece of bread directly from a guard, she did so without trembling. It was a small thing, almost trivial, but it marked a turning point. The guard didn't smile or speak. He simply extended the loaf, his gloves dusted with flour. Their fingers brushed for an instant. It wasn't warmth she felt, it was recognition. She was no longer invisible. That simple exchange carried a strange dignity, one she hadn't known she was still capable of feeling. At night, the camp changed. The lamps along the fences glowed dimly, and the air smelled of damp wood and iron. The women whispered, less conserving energy for dreams that rarely came. Sometimes Aiko would lie awake listening to the faraway hum of engines or the faint strains of music from the guards' quarters. It was strange how easily sound could cross wire meant to divide lives. The melody, though foreign, had begun to feel familiar. She caught herself humming it under her breath once, then stopped ashamed of how easily boundaries could fade when no one was watching. Days blurred together, but within their sameness, subtle transformations took root. Aiko noticed how her body no longer stiffened at every order. How her steps had found rhythm again. She had learned to read the routine not as threat, but as language, the way the guards' tone softened when the camp behaved, the way their silence carried no malice. Fear had not disappeared. It had simply grown quieter, replaced by a hesitant understanding of structure. Still, she could not forget. The war was too near, too raw. Some mornings she would wake with the image of her city burning behind her eyelids, the crackle of radio voices calling for loyalty, the screams drowned by propaganda that told them dying was sacred. That world had shattered, but its pieces still clung to her. The hardest part wasn't the captivity. It was learning to live without the lies that had once made survival easier. One evening, rain began to fall, a steady cold drizzle that turned the yard to mud. The guards hurried to cover the supplies while the women huddled under a tent flap, their faces turned toward the storm. Aiko watched the raindrops slide down the barbed wire, gathering in tiny beads before falling to the ground. It struck her that the wire was rusting just like everything else man had built to divide. For the first time, she didn't see it as a wall. She saw it as something that could one day crumble. After the rain, the camp smelled of earth and soap, of something both human and sterile. Aiko walked outside, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet ground. The world felt softer underfoot. She stood by the fence for a long time, breathing in the damp air, watching the mist rise. Beyond the perimeter, the fields stretched empty and silent, but they no longer looked like the edge of the world. They looked like distance reachable someday. In the days that followed, small acts began to stitch fragments of normalcy together. The guards no longer barked orders, but spoke them quietly. The women began to help with cleaning, repairing torn blankets, tending to one another's wounds. Each gesture, each exchange, became a thread, fragile but real, weaving a kind of peace none of them would have believed possible. The camp was still a prison, yet it pulsed with a strange rhythm of coexistence. Aiko often found herself reflecting on that first shower, the moment that had broken her world apart and rebuilt it in silence. It had started as terror and ended as revelation. Now she understood that the act itself had been ordinary for those who gave it, but extraordinary for those who received it. That was the cruel irony of survival. It often came disguised as routine. She began to wonder what the Americans thought when they looked at them. Did they see enemies or just people left over from a broken war? She doubted they thought about it at all. Their faces revealed fatigue more than hatred. They followed orders just as she once had, but theirs carried a different weight. A discipline grounded not in ideology, but in something quieter, steadier. As the weeks passed, the fear of death gave way to the heavier burden of reflection. Aiko realized that survival was not the end of suffering, it was the beginning of memory. The world she had belonged to was gone, replaced by a place where right and wrong blurred under the same sky. Yet in that uncertainty, she discovered a fragile kind of freedom, the freedom to see clearly. One morning as the sun rose over the camp, Aiko noticed a guard helping another prisoner lift a water barrel that had tipped during the night. The gesture was small, almost invisible in the vast machinery of war, but it stopped her. The two men worked in silence, mud clinging to their boots, their movements awkward but cooperative. No one else seemed to notice. Aiko did. And in that moment, something settled quietly inside her, the understanding that decency could survive even in captivity. That night, before sleeping, she took the small bar of soap she had kept hidden and pressed it to her face. Its scent had faded, but the memory remained. It wasn't just a token of survival anymore. It was proof that truth could live in the simplest things, in water, in bread, in the shared silence between enemies who no longer knew why they had been told to hate. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since surrender, her breath came easy. The war outside might still rage in stories and memories, but inside her, a different kind of peace had begun. The nights grew longer as winter crept toward the camp, each one carrying a kind of quiet that was no longer terrifying but reflective. The war outside had ended months ago, yet for Aiko and the others, time had become fluid, days melting into one another, unmarked by anything but routine and thought. The fear that had once defined every breath had turned into something softer, heavier contemplation. When the guards spoke now, the words no longer sounded foreign. When they passed by, their faces no longer seemed to belong to the enemy. And when the women gathered by the fence in the fading light, their silence was no longer born of dread, but of memory. Aiko sat by herself one morning, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of cooling tea. The sky above was a pale, colorless blue, the kind that seemed to exist only in places between endings and beginnings. She could hear the faint clang of metal from the kitchens, the distant laughter of a guard, small ordinary sounds that had once filled her with anxiety, but now only deepened the strange ache inside her chest. She realized she no longer waited for freedom as she once had. What she waited for now was understanding. She had survived long enough to see that truth did not arrive with parades or victory songs. It came quietly hidden in the simplest gestures, in the clean scent of soap, the heat of water, the way the guards handed out bread each morning without cruelty. Survival, she understood now, was not a gift from mercy, but from procedure, and yet somehow that made it more profound. The Americans followed rules not because they loved their prisoners, but because they believed in order. And within that order, even enemies could find fragments of dignity. For the first time in her life, Aiko questioned the teachings that had shaped her world. She remembered her childhood classroom, the maps marked in red, the voices of teachers insisting that the West sought only to destroy them, that surrender would mean shame and suffering. She had believed it so completely that even kindness had once looked like deception. But here in this fenced world built on silence and structure, she had seen the opposite. She had seen humanity emerge through discipline, compassion hidden behind formality. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't forgive the war. But it shattered the illusion that cruelty was inevitable. At night, lying beneath the thin blanket, she would recall the first moment of hot water striking her shoulders, the first scent of soap cutting through the filth of the march. That single act had divided her life into two halves, before and after. Before, she had lived in fear and obedience, measuring worth by loyalty to false promises. After, she began to see that decency, even from an enemy, was not weakness but strength, the kind of strength her own leaders had demanded but never practiced. The women around her carried their own awakenings. Some whispered that they felt shame not for their defeat, but for the years spent believing lies. Others said nothing at all, their silence heavier than speech. Yet all of them in their own ways began to change. When one of the guards stumbled in the mud one morning, 2 women rushed forward to help him up. The act was small, instinctive, but it drew a hush across the yard. The guard stared speechless, before muttering a single word, thanks, in clumsy German. Aiko watched the exchange, and understood then how fragile hatred really was. It survived only as long as people refused to see each other. In those moments, she began to sense something like peace. Not the peace promised by treaties or flags, but the quiet understanding that survival itself was a form of defiance. They had been told they would be erased, reduced to nothing, yet they still breathed, still thought, still dreamed. Even within fences, they remained human. That realization was more powerful than freedom because it belonged to them alone. Sometimes when the nights were clear, Aiko would stand near the fence and look at the stars. They were the same ones she had seen as a child before the war, before the uniforms, before the fear. For a long time, she had thought those stars belonged to the victorious, the ones who survived untouched. Now she knew better. They belonged to everyone, even the defeated, even those who had been stripped of everything but breath. She thought about the soldiers guarding them, young men who probably longed for home as much as she did. Perhaps some of them had families, waiting mothers, who worried wives, who prayed. Perhaps they too had been told lies about who their enemies were. It didn't matter anymore. The wire between them no longer seemed like a wall. It felt like a mirror reflecting 2 kinds of weariness shaped by the same war. The camp itself had begun to change with the season. Snow gathered on the roofs of the barracks, softening the harsh lines of the fences. The mornings came quieter, the cold keeping even the guards subdued. One day, as Aiko swept the pathway outside her tent, a guard walked past and dropped something beside her, a piece of paper folded twice. When he had gone, she opened it cautiously. Inside was a rough pencil sketch, a mountain range under a wide sky. A few lines so delicate they looked like they could vanish in the wind. On the back, one word was written, home. Aiko stared at it for a long time. The drawing wasn't remarkable, but its simplicity hit her like a blow. It was proof that the war had not destroyed everything, that somewhere beneath the weight of orders and uniforms, someone still remembered what beauty looked like. She folded it carefully and tucked it inside her sleeve. That night she placed it beside the bar of soap under her pillow, 2 symbols of everything she had learned, that dignity could be preserved through rules and that kindness could survive through silence. When spring arrived, rumors of transfer began to spread again. This time there was no panic, only a quiet readiness. They didn't know where they were being sent, to another camp perhaps, or to freedom, but it didn't matter. What had once felt like a march toward death now felt like a passage through truth. Aiko walked with her head high, her steps steady. The war had taken her innocence, her family, her beliefs, but it had not taken her ability to see. On their final morning, as they lined up to leave, she looked back at the camp one last time. The fences gleaming faintly in the sun, the guards standing at attention, the faint smoke rising from the kitchens. Everything looked exactly as it had when she arrived, and yet it was entirely different. It wasn't the place that had changed, it was her. As the truck rumbled to life and the gates swung open, Aiko glanced down at her hands. They were rough-scarred, lined with dirt, yet clean. She thought of the first time she'd seen water pour from the pipes and the disbelief that had gripped her chest. Now she understood the truth of it. That moment hadn't been about mercy or forgiveness. It had been about reclaiming humanity from beneath the rubble of war. She leaned her head against the side of the truck, feeling the vibration of the engine beneath her. The wind caught her hair, carrying with it the faint scent of soap that still lingered in the fabric of her clothes. Around her, the women sat in silence, each lost in thought. None of them spoke of revenge or bitterness. They spoke, if at all, of what came next: fields to rebuild, families to find, lives to start again. Aiko closed her eyes and let the wind sting her face. For the first time, she felt the ache of hope, not naive, not blind, but born from everything she had endured. She whispered to herself so softly that only the wind could hear. We were told that surrender meant death. But it only meant truth, and in that moment she understood that survival was more than the absence of dying. It was the decision to see the world again, not through fear, not through pride, but through the fragile, enduring grace of being human. As the truck disappeared down the dirt road, the camp faded into the distance, just fences, smoke, and silence, dissolving into the horizon. Aiko held the folded sketch in one hand, the bar of soap in the other, two fragile proofs that even in war, decency had survived. The world ahead was uncertain, but her heart was steady. She had seen the enemy's face and found not monsters, but men, not vengeance, but order. And in that quiet revelation, she carried a truth worth living for, that even in defeat, dignity can be rebuilt one act of humanity at a time.